Good evening and welcome. My name is Aska Hisa, and I am the Director of Learning and Engagement at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, also known as ICALA. We're excited to present tonight's book talk titled Tamara Lanier's Fight with Harvard to #Free Renty. It's in partnership with Hyperallergic. Tonight's event is a confluence of good stuff. The very recent book release of From These Roots, My Fight with Harvard to Reclaim My Legacy by Tamara Lanier with Penguin. It's a book describing Lanier's struggle with Harvard University regarding its ownership and control over images of her great-great-great-grandfather, Renty Taylor, and his daughter, Delia, both of whom were photographed as part of a Harvard professor's racist research. 2, the exhibition Ciencia Sexualis at ICALA, co-curated by Jennifer Doyle and Jean Vaccaro, which examines the fraught relationship of sex, gender, and science with a presentation of work by 27 artists, including the work by artist Colleen Smith that references and honors Lanier's ancestors, Renty, Delia, among others, but we will be discussing Renty and Delia tonight. And 3, this partnership with Hyperallergic and its co-founder, editor-in-chief Hrag Vartanian, who has been following and reporting on Tamara Lanier's case for years. So this trifecta of interest and investment, we hope, will result in a rich discussion on this journey toward justice. The exhibition Ciencia Sexualis is on view in Los Angeles until March 2nd. However, if you're tuning in from outside our city, it is available to see virtually with the link that we're going to provide in the chat. What we'll also provide in the chat are the extended bios of our speakers so that we don't have to read them right now. And with that, trust that we have amazing people for you, and you can read their bios when you have time. I'm going to pass it now to Jennifer Doyle and Jean Vaccaro, who will give a brief introduction, and we'll keep moving toward our esteemed guest speakers, Tamara Lanier and Hrag Vartanian. This program will run for nearly an hour, and we will monitor the Q&A box for your questions to address toward the end. And if you'd like to stay past the 1-hour mark, we will continue some discussion and reflection on the exhibition with the co-curators and Hrag Vartanian. Thank you for attending tonight's online program.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm Jennifer Doyle, one of the co-curators of the exhibition. Jean, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jean Vaccaro, other co-curator. Really happy for tonight's program.
Okay, I'm going to share a screen. Sorry, it's like, and I think this, just hoping everybody can see that. Does that make what you're seeing make sense? Okay. So I have on my background actually a shot of the entryway into the exhibition at ICALA, and hanging from the rafters are these gorgeous banners from Colleen Smith. This work is called Venus. Oh, sorry, that's it should say 2024 there. These are actually, this is actually 2 sides of the same banner, and you'll see names Venus, Delia, Anarcha, Phoeba, Sally, Drana, and Joanna, and there are multiple banners in the exhibition. Here is one called Black Pearl, and this has the names Linda, Diana, Renty, and Delia on it. And here you can see both sides of that banner. And we are just thrilled to have Tammy Lanier here to talk with us. You can see I'm a little like starstruck because Tammy will be talking with us about a couple of the names on the banner and the project of, in essence, reconnecting the present to the past through family oral histories, community-based work, the happenstance, chance, good luck kinds of kismet that the world sometimes brings to you when you really need it. There's this book Up From These Roots contains so many conversations that then conversations with friends, with people, acquaintances that lead to on just peeling back really important layers in Tammy's family history. Um, Tammy's story, I'm going to let Hrag and Tammy really tell you the bulk of the story, but any exhibition like ours that's wrestling with really intense histories and with work like Colleen Smith's that's taking on a lot of weight, it forces us to think too about the role of institutions, universities, and museums, and reproducing scenes of exclusion, erasure, and real harm. And as we've worked on this show, we've thought a lot actually about the work of the curatorial work as putting you really in a quite close relationship with the mechanisms that really do hurt people. And these banners are remarkable. They're celebratory, they're warm, and they're inviting. And behind them are really intense stories. Each work in the exhibition is like a doorway into an archive and a bibliography. And we're just really happy to have Tammy Lanier here to connect us with one of these names. Years ago when I first started thinking about artists who were working with these images, it never did I dream that I would meet a family member who could tell us more about the people in those photographs. So thank you for being here. And Hrag, thank you for your work at Hyperallergic and paying attention to Tammy's research and her struggle with Harvard University, which we'll be learning more about.
Great. Thank you so much. This is such an honor to be here and for continuing this conversation with Tammy. Jean, I wasn't sure if she was going to say something as well.
Sure. Jennifer really prompted me to think that, like, I also just want to name two things in advance of this conversation. One is that there's a beautiful conversation between Jennifer and me and Riley Snorton, who's an incredible scholar in Black studies and in trans studies. It's about this kind of question of naming. And so for folks who are interested, please look at that. And also just a big thank you to both of you and to the ICALA in this moment where we have to continue to name the harm that has happened in the past and that happens in the present moment and against the incredible censorship that we're facing. Thank you for being here and for bringing us into this conversation and allowing us to name names. Thanks. We'll be back after the talk.
Perfect. Looking forward to continuing that conversation with you, Jean and Jennifer. So I just want to show the book. This is my very well-loved copy of the uncorrected proof. For those of you who have not had the pleasure of seeing the book yet. And I just want to say, Tammy, it was one of the things about following this story through the years has been the generosity you've shown in terms of being open about your process and being transparent. And one of the things that really comes through in the book is the step-by-step, in the discoveries, in the being open about what you learned along the way and what challenged you as a descendant, as a researcher, as somebody who's really interested in pursuing truth. And I just want to sort of commend the whole process in the book. Like, to be able to be open like that is not necessarily an easy thing. So first of all, I want to say thank you.
I thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the kind words about the book.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. But I want to start because this book starts with your mother, and this whole journey starts very much with your mother, Maddie Pearl Thompson. And I wonder if you could communicate a little about her for people who never had the pleasure of knowing her. And what was it that she gave you that you are now sort of bringing forward to new generations? And I want to say, for those who hadn't the pleasure yet of the audiobook, your daughter reads the audiobook. And your daughter is fantastic. And she just, I mean, her voice, the way she sort of said it, she emotes so much of the story. I just want to say that for people, highly recommend the audiobook, as well as the physical book. But can you tell us a little bit about your mother?
My mother, well, to start with, I often say that my mother and I were probably closer than any mother and daughter should be. We were so very close. My mother was such a loving, nurturing woman. She, in addition to being a stay-at-home parent for myself and my siblings, my brother and sister. She was a foster parent. She just had so much love to give. She was the daughter of sharecropper parents. She was born in a small rural community called Mount Meigs, Montgomery, Alabama. And she grew up, as she liked to describe it, in the cradle of the civil rights movement. She went to school with civil rights icons like Ralph Abernathy. She often talked about having to help him do his work. She migrated to Connecticut on the same student exchange program that Martin Luther King visited Connecticut on. She was a community person. She was a retired teacher. She was a principal. And she was, I like to frame it as my daughters and I best educator. My mom had, she loved to talk about her oral history. And my mom, uniquely, when my mom would talk about her enslaved ancestors, she was sharing from a firsthand experience because she grew up with her ancestor, her grandfather, who was also named Renty. There are 5 generations of men in my family in this lineal plane that are named after the man in the image, Renty. My mother's grandfather, my mother's brother was the last Renty. But my mother's grandfather, Renty, was born a slave, lived many years as a slave, and would share these amazing stories about Papa Renty, who he was, and about living as an enslaved person. So these stories that my mom shared with me were real. She got these stories not from books, not from scholars, but firsthand from a formerly enslaved person. And so one thing that my mom would often say is always remember and never forget and write it down. And I like to refer to her as the keeper of our family story. My mom was the one that if a family member couldn't remember exactly the details of something that happened years ago, they'd call her up and they'd say, "Hey, Maddie, do you remember so and so?" And my mom had an amazing memory. And you know, it's all about memory and how it persists and how it persevered. And our oral history, starting back in the late 1700s, early 1800s with Papa Renty, to where I sit today, is as accurate as any document. And that's one thing that I often marvel about. My mom never saw the census information, the enslaved burial ground records, the documents that I used to piece the story together. But it was almost as if when she was telling us these stories, she was reading from them. That's how accurate our oral history was.
Right. And I think you really touch on that in the book, where you talk about how the victors write history, but
Yeah.
it seems it comes across as a real sort of victory of like memory as
Yeah.
a document, right?
Yes.
And the way. So I wonder about the process of writing the book and dealing with the complexity of retrieving family memories and
Mm,
how that sort of worked and the collective history that that represents and how
yeah.
many layers there are to that. And, you know, and of course, sometimes family members remember certain parts while other families don't remember those certain parts. Can you tell us a little bit about that process of that retrieving of that collective
Yeah.
memory?
It is a painstaking and difficult process. The one thing that I can say is I had the presence of mind to record my mom telling some of these stories. Thank God for that, because in replaying those conversations, there were things that I did not remember that jumped out at me. Some of the things, like the mentioning of specific family members, that I had forgotten. But when I replayed it, specifically George Thompson, and my mom talking about George Thompson, that was key to linking me to the enslaver, Benjamin Franklin Taylor. So, you know, not only with, you know, in terms of the many layers of, you know, oral history and memory and how it persisted The other thing that we're documenters. My daughter, the one who read the audiobook, her very first book report was on Papa Renty when she was a small girl in 4th grade. And she and my mom sat down and put this book together. I kept it. And so when I was hearing that Harvard was saying I could never prove it, it dawned on me, we were talking about Paparenti before they knew about the daguerreotypes. We were celebrating this man and honoring his rich oral history and his legacy long before there was any knowledge of the daguerreotypes. And I had documents to prove it. So, the documents, the artifacts, the things that we kept, the oral history, the recordings, the constant reminder to always remember and never forget, and the stories that always started with the proud Black African. These are all things that when I put them together is what helped me. It's like my mom left me a blueprint.
Right.
And I just followed the breadcrumbs, so to speak, and pieced this amazing story together. But it would not be possible were it not for my mom sitting, listening attentively to the stories from her enslaved ancestor, her grandfather, about who this man was and what he was to his children.
Right. What do you think gave your mother that clarity? Because for many people, when there are wounds, they often cover them up, or they have difficulty because they can be very overwhelming. What
Yeah.
gave her that clarity? Was it her faith? Was it her something else? Was there something else that you think contributed to that?
And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because my father never wanted to talk about his family and would never talk about it. But my mother was the complete opposite. She embraced this. And she was just the unique woman. She had a memory that was so specific. And just when you would sit and hear her talk about these things, she was an amazing storyteller. And she just, when she would talk about these stories, when she would talk about our ancestors, when she would talk about Papa Renty, my daughter said something pretty profound. My oldest daughter, Shanrel, she said, when Grandma would tell us these stories, I created an image of who Papa Renty was in my mind, of this man 10 feet tall. And so, she just told such colorful stories that took you there, that imported you to that space, that moment in time that she was sharing. And uniquely, my mom was sharing what was shared to her. I like to imagine that her grandfather Renty shared with her these stories in such a way that created an image for her, that created moments where she felt transported back with these ancestors. But she was an amazing storyteller, and would tell these stories with such a flair and with such color. It was just rememberable. It helped to remember these events.
Absolutely. I definitely see that in the way you relay the story. Now, one of the themes that comes out through your book is the immense frustration with institutions of various kinds. The University of Harvard would be the primary one, but there were also frustrations with other museums, as well as, I mean, in some ways, when you talk to the family of the plantation owners, the descendants, even with religious institutions in some ways, in terms of the way they sort of chose to remember or cover up perhaps some of these stories. So can you tell us a little bit about the limitations of institutions you learned, or the way memory and institutions function?
I saw it as academic arrogance. I expected early on that there would be an excitement about a descendant coming forward with insight and information as to who these enslaved people were, a curiosity, an eagerness or a willingness to learn or to hear, and to get a better understanding of who this man is that they have spent so much time writing about, talking about, hosting seminars about. So I expected this, on some level, excitement. and I didn't get it. And what I also came to realize is what I perceived was there was the notion that scholarship somehow superseded or had more credibility and importance than oral histories. And that oral histories are and have been marginalized, and that scholars feel because of their academic prowess or because of their academic history, they're better suited to tell our stories. And my experience with Harvard, it was actually beyond that, because I felt like it was a dismissal. It was like, we're not even interested. We don't even want to hear your stories, let alone, okay, we'll entertain it. They didn't want to hear it. And so it was an arrogance that suggested that only the scholars have the credibility and the ability to narrate these very important stories, these oral histories, and to tell, the scholars seem to be in a position where they felt that they were better suited to tell my story.
And in terms of museums, what did it teach you about museums? Because you have this, you have a number of really interesting observations, including the fact that the courthouse and the museum often had a similar architectural feel for
Yeah.
you. And even visually, some of those institutions looked alike.
Yeah.
Now, but what did it teach you about museums in general?
This whole notion of ethical scholarship. And again, not only ethical scholarship, but when there is a question of plundered property, who gets to tell the story, and how much of the story includes those impacted, and specifically not only the enslaved people, but their descendants. So the role of the descendants and the people impacted, the aggrieved groups, what I came to learn is they have no voice, and there's no interest in giving them a voice. And museums want to tell the story, and they will tell it from their perspective. And, they may, engage in some gaslighting practices where they're saying we're looking at our history and we're including, but the reality is the descendants and the impacted people have no voice.
Right.
And there's something inherently wrong in that and unethical about that. And this whole notion of ethical stewards and who are going to be the better custodians of history, particularly when it comes to telling the history of American chattel slavery. Historically, Black voices have been marginalized.
Right. It sort of reminds me, having covered museums and protests and different sort of activism around them. There's this saying that often is repeated, which is they want our objects, but not our bodies. And your
Yeah.
story brings that up, where
Yes.
in terms of like, they don't want a living person in front of them. They want the objects that they create in front of them, so that it's also a form of control
Yeah.
of those objects. So now, what do you think, what would have been a way that an institution like a museum could have, maybe at the beginning when you were just wanting to tell your story initially, what could they have done to sort of welcome you into that conversation?
I never really asked for much in the beginning. I only asked, and actually I put this in writing, so that's not a matter of question, or it's not in question. Sit down with me, look at my research. Tell me if you see what I see, that I'm a direct descendant of Renty. And I also wanted to know, because the irony of my Papa Renty being chosen to be the symbol of Black inferiority, for him to be used as a tool to prove his own inhumanity, was so ironic to me, because Papa Renty's oral history was that he was an educator, that he was self-taught, that he taught himself to read, that he taught others to read, and that he also was a learned man who preached gospels. He preached the gospel, and he was a religious person. So, you know, I just thought it was interesting, and that Harvard and the world would want to know that the one person or the people that they chose, because my oral history also was that if you had a desire to read, Papa Renty would teach you. So I know that Delia was very likely educated as well. And so the irony of choosing this self-taught educator as the symbol of Black inferiority or white supremacy was just mind-boggling to me. And I thought the world had a right to know that the enslaved people that they chose to promote this scientific racism actually turned the science on its head, because they were educators. They were everything, the exact opposite of what the science was suggesting. And I thought that Harvard would at least listen to that and embrace that. And they weren't interested in hearing any of this. And so, you know, I originally, and you know, the other bizarre thing is, as the story is being told, other academic institutions are over the moon excited, and this is you know, this is amazing. You know, this is the next Roots. I've heard people, I have people have written me to say, and everyone was very excited about the notion of understanding who this man was, but Harvard. And so I knew, you know, that there was, my specific requests were look at my genealogy and tell the truth about who this enslaved man was. And they wanted no interest in either.
One of the things that I think in the conversations in the book that I think is really powerful is when you talk about these as the first documented examples of racial profiling. And you said that these were used to present these Black men and women, not for who they were, but for who he wanted them to be. And then you talk about how they were used as propaganda to poison people's imaginations and devalue Black lives. And you compare it to many of the false narratives or a lot of the things that go on today. Now,
Yes.
that's a pretty incredible sort of part of this sort of visual history and talking about anti-Blackness and how it works in our society. Now, what can you tell us a little bit about that process, sort of understanding it, and any thoughts you have about that now?
I actually am a seated member on Connecticut's Racial Profiling Prohibition Board. And you know, in writing this and also working on the board, I happened, you know, it dawned on me that these are some of the first images of enslaved people. So photography was a new medium in 1850. And so Louis Agassiz, the Harvard scientist who created this racial myth about Black inferiority, he chose my enslaved ancestors to promote a science that Blacks were inferior, or that Black people were inferior. And he used imagery to prove that. And so he was not interested in knowing who these enslaved people were. He wanted to capture an image that furthered his scientific theory. And if you look at the images, you will see, you know, one of the things I think he intentionally points to the stark differences, specifically with the men who were photographed or whose images were taken. And he wants to point to the stark differences and say, look, this is not human. This is not like us. And so he had no interest in knowing who these men and women were. He only wanted to project an image of who he wanted them to be, and that was inferior. And the irony, you know, one of the things that I learned when I visited with the slaveholder's great grandson, Dr. Edmund Taylor, is that the Taylors knew that these enslaved people could read and write. And so the science that Boston and I mean the Agassiz and the Websters all visited South Carolina to develop, they knew that these were extraordinary people because they're teaching themselves to read, but then they still promoted this race science that they had to know was not valid because they knew that Renty could read.
Right. And maybe this is a good opportunity to bring up some of those images of your visit to the family, to the Taylor family, if we can see those. Now, that's I think, one of the most moving parts of the book as well. And I know in our previous conversation we had, people have reached out to me to sort of mention how moved they were by this experience you had of going to the family of the plantation owners, their descendants, and sitting at a table and being surrounded by objects that your ancestors created. Do you want to talk a little bit about what we're looking at here and some of the objects and the experience you had at that home?
Yeah, well, I want to first acknowledge the woman there on the bottom right. Her name is Rose Shiver. She is the woman from Columbia, South Carolina, who coordinated my visit, who made my visit, firstly, who made the conversation with Dr. Edmund Taylor possible, and then was also responsible for some of the things that we were able to capture when I visited South Carolina. But I had a conversation with Dr. Edmund Taylor, who is on the top left with his wife, Mary. And I explained to him that I was trying to piece my family together. I was doing a genealogical project, and that I was trying to find descendants of Benjamin Franklin Taylor, the slaveholder, in order to find my family. And I needed to know where the slaveholders' children landed so that I can find those that they enslaved. And so after a brief conversation, I was invited to come and spend the weekend with Dr. Edmund Taylor, the great grandson of Benjamin Franklin Taylor. And he lives in Columbia, South Carolina. And that was a surreal experience. I can say, when I shared with my daughters that I first invited them to come with me, I said, we're going to go to Columbia, South Carolina to spend the weekend with the family who enslaved our ancestors. And they were like, we're not going. I couldn't get them to go. But, I am so glad that I went because I learned so much from Dr. Edmund Taylor. And, between Dr. Edmund Taylor was like the keeper of his family story, just as my mom was the keeper of her family story. What was so bizarre was, and sitting listening to him, he was telling me the same stories that I had heard from my mother. And so while I'm sitting there in that moment, I'm thinking, I am hearing the same stories from the slaveholder's perspective and the enslaved man Renty's perspective. They were the same exact stories. Dr. Taylor talked about the fact that the Taylor family operated an underground railroad and allowed a number of their slaves to escape to Ohio. My mom talked about Renty's descendants escaping on the Underground Railroad to Ohio. Dr. Taylor talked about, again, the fact that the slaves could read, write, and preach the gospel. My mom was saying actually almost verbatim the same thing about Papa Renty. And he also, he gave me some documents where he had written about a woman who he referred to as Mama Letty. And I remember thinking, whether or not Dr. Taylor knew it or not, he was embracing African culture, because in our family, the tradition was to call the women, the elder women, Mama, and the men, Papa, Papa Renty, Papa Simon, Papa Jake. On the women's side, we had Mama Turi, Mama Ophelia, and he's talking about Mama Letty. And I remember thinking, he may not realize this, but he's embracing Black culture by calling her what obviously her family and loved ones called her. And it was surreal to me that, I was hearing the same story but from two very opposite perspectives. And then he also said, we were sitting at the table, we were eating from the dishes of the slaveholder, Benjamin Franklin Taylor, which you can kind of see in the far top right, the dishes and the table that was set. And he said, you're sitting at the table and chair, and the woodwork in this room was hand carved by the Taylor family carpenter. And in that moment, you literally could have knocked me over with a feather, because I knew from reading the slave index that my enslaved ancestor was the family carpenter. And so I was just trapped in that moment, because he continued to talk. I don't know what he said, because I wasn't hearing him anymore. I was just fixated on the sophistication of the woodwork, and how after 200 years, these things still stand and are durable, and just amazing work of art. I was just amazed. And you know, I visited with Dr. Taylor. We traveled around Colombia. He took us to the place where the original plantation was. Dr. Taylor was the keeper of his family story. He was very proud of his ancestry. He was very proud of the Taylor legacy. And it was important to him that I think he wanted me to know that, and he actually said that the Taylors were God-fearing Christians who treated their enslaved with dignity and respect. And so I felt like Dr. Taylor wanted to show me all that the Taylors had done to give back, and that they weren't bad people, that they were Christians, and they treated their enslaved with dignity and respect. And so, you know, I went there, and I had one intention, and I was very purposeful about that. I just needed information. I wasn't there to judge. I wasn't there to condemn. I just wanted to know about the Taylor family so that I could find my family. But I felt that he needed me to believe that they were good, God-fearing Christians and good slaveholders.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely comes through where you talk about them in the way they're trying to sort of seem like benevolent
Yes.
enslavers.
Yeah.
Which I mean, you know, it seems like an oxymoron, but
And I think, and we had conversations about that. There were two things, because, firstly, I wanted him to understand that there was no dignity in slavery. And I also wanted, when we were talking about Benjamin Franklin Taylor in allowing the daguerreotypes to be taken, the Harvard scientist Louis Agassiz and Boston politicians were all visiting this the Taylor plantation to see these enslaved people. And Dr. Edmund Taylor, he wrote about this, and he expressed this, that after these Boston politicians and Harvard scientists all traveled to south to Benjamin Franklin Taylor's plantation to see the benevolence of the Taylors, that the politician Daniel Webster, who was a statesman, who he was in the senator from Boston, and he went back and he vowed never to speak against slavery again. And I remembered a conversation where I said, do you really think these Boston politicians and scholars were all coming just to see the benevolence of the Taylors? They were all heavily invested themselves in the Industrial Revolution, and they had a reason for creating this race science and for promoting this ugly white supremacist notion of polygenesis.
right. And here, one of the reasons I wanted us to also see the cemetery images is one of the things you do in the book is then you go and visit what they suggested were grave markers for some of the enslaved people. Specifically Sancho, which was one of the enslaved peoples from the same generation as your ancestors. And can you tell us a little bit about what we're seeing and what you actually found in the grave site?
Yes. And I just want to preface this by saying, if you haven't visited an enslaved burial ground or historic African American burial ground, I just prepare people for what you are going to see, the kind of disrepair and the disregard for Black life was what shocked me to my core. The bottom pictures there, the three at the bottom, the two plants there, I was told, are yucca plants, and that these plants were used as markers when enslaved people were buried. Their loved ones would mark their graves with these beautiful plants. They bloom in the spring and they flower and they're beautiful. Unfortunately, I happened to be there when they hadn't bloomed. But when I looked around in all the disrepair, the wave of the yucca plants that I saw, the sea of yucca plants that I saw all over the place, I had a certain attack of disrepair. I felt so much sadness for the enslaved people that had built the South, the Southern community. These people were born into servitude. They were enslaved for their entire lives. And when they died, after all the work that they had done to build the South, they were just discarded. And the only thing that could resemble any sense of acknowledgement were these yucca plants that were placed at their head. It was just a terribly sad feeling. I remember thinking about the devaluing of Black life and the invisibility of the enslaved as if they didn't exist.
And the Taylor said that there was a tombstone for this one
Yeah.
person, but
Yes.
that wasn't the case, was it?
And so when I met with Dr. Taylor, and he talked about the fact that Sancho was buried in the Taylor Cemetery. And so Rose and I, and we toured the Taylor Cemetery. Initially, we didn't see anything, but we did see the amazing marble monuments that were erected for the Taylor family. So I was looking at, I certainly wasn't looking or expecting that they would give him the same consideration that they did their loved ones. But since you're putting him in your cemetery, where's the headstone that, and what it turns out there were just some boulders that were placed over. And this is the picture that Rose later sent to me when she found what she thought might have been Sancho's headstone. But yes, I remember thinking, you're implying that you're doing this great courtesy by allowing him to be buried in your family cemetery. He might have been better off with his loved ones if this is the kind of treatment that he received.
Right. So a number of contemporary artists have used images of your ancestors. What would you like us to think about when artists and scholars are using these images? And what would you like artists to think about when they're using them, or just addressing them even?
I want artists to be intentional in their use of the images, to remember that Renty and Delia aren't artifacts, they're ancestors, they are loved ones. And certainly I encourage the use, and there is a struggle that I have about the use, and we could talk about that. But I think what's most important in using these images is that what you do restores, protects, preserves their dignity and humanity. And I say that in contrast to what, there's one author who reenacted the taking of the daguerreotypes. And I saw that, I remember thinking, would you reenact a rape? Would you reenact a violent assault? Or, those are things that I think do harm and perpetuate the harm, as opposed to doing something to give them their humanity back. And so whatever an artist does, if they could look at it and say, does this give Renty his dignity back? I will celebrate that. But if you're reenacting and recreating the injury, it just causes further victimization.
During our previous conversation, I asked you what your biggest question that still lingers was. And the question at the time you said was why Harvard has responded the way it has. I wonder if you have any new thoughts about that, about the way Harvard has responded.
I can only speculate because Harvard's response makes no sense, made no sense then and makes no sense today. But I can only speculate. And, certainly I have learned as I have gone along in this journey, and I've gotten so much information and insight from so many people. But there's this one student, he is an archivist. I think he is now in law school. His name is Jared Drake, and he wrote a brief for our complaint when we went before the Mass Supreme Judicial Court. And he entitled it Harvard Archives Bear Strange Fruits. And what he talks about is this notion of providence and documents of dubious origins, and what he made real for me was the fact that there's a whole question of title and good title, and that the way he framed it, unless it's hiding in plain sight, Harvard just simply doesn't have good title. And what it also made clear for me is that, what was suggested is just that there is a lot that is curated that shouldn't be. And that when you have these documents that have these dubious origins, there is protocol that says you have to be the ethical steward and give up these artifacts. And so I think that Harvard fights me, and I talk about in the book Harvard's white knuckle retention of my ancestors' cultural property. I think it's for fear they don't want to open Pandora's box about what is happening in museums today, what they're curating it, why they're curating it, and how they're curating it. It's a larger discussion that needs to be had, and about the custodial responsibilities of ethical stewardship, and how to proceed when you're holding artifacts that have such a dark history.
Mm-hmm. So I want to invite Jean and Jennifer to come back in. And while they're coming back in, I wanted to ask you, did you know what you were getting into with this case? And when did you commit to follow to the end? And was there a moment of clarity for you in that process?
Originally, I had no idea what I was getting into. No, I didn't. I only know that I am driven and motivated by one thing, and that's the love and respect I have for my mother. And every time that Harvard said she can never prove it, or she's given us nothing to show that her Renty is our Renty, that was like a slap in the face to my mother and to my ancestry. It was spitting and stepping on my ancestral heritage and pride. And I saw that as a personal affront. And every time they said there's no way she can do it, it forced me to dig deeper, to work harder, to search longer. I knew when the moment I looked at Papa Renty in that image, that was my ancestor, the man that I had heard so many stories about for my entire life. And I knew that I would find the evidence to prove it.
So, and then this is a question both for you, Tammy, as well as for Jennifer, about what do you think some of the lessons this book teaches us about this moment? And Tammy, do you have some thoughts about that? What you think it tells us about this moment we're in right now?
There is so much. And there's so many lessons in this book. And, I just really, I just poured out my soul. The whole issue of academic arrogance. I'm hoping that academic institutions will take a look at this book and say that we have to be more mindful, be more sympathetic, be more inclusive of Black voices, of Black history, of Black ancestry, of oral history, and that our academic scholarship should never be the focus or the sole focus, and that oral histories and Black legacies are equally as important as scholarship. There's also a piece about just the genealogical research and what that entails and the places that it takes you and how emotional that is. When I'm going through some of the census and the slave indexes, and I'm going down and I'm sorting my ancestors out amongst chattel like cows and pigs, it's a painful experience that is hard to describe, because I like to say that, and my daughter has said this once before, when you look at enslaved people in the history of enslaved people, you look at them in a way, but when you look at them and know that they're your ancestors, it is an entirely different experience. So when I'm going through my family tree and sorting out the cows and the pigs and the other chattel, it's just such a devaluing of Black life. I just had nothing but empathy for my ancestors for what they endured. And the genealogical work for Black people is so very different from the people who did not descend from American chattel slavery. The experience is so different. And I like to say that my experience was, a labor of love, where I'm piecing my family back together like I am an adoptive child who is trying to find loved ones. It's necessary work. It's work that, it's painful work. And I look at my white counterparts who find it as, something they enjoy doing, a leisure, exercise. And the experience is so different and so emotional, particularly for descendants of American chattel slavery. And I don't think that people recognize that. And finally, the whole legal piece and the question of who owns the rights to the violence of the past, and and how courts. I like to remind people. I have looked. I believe that this case is the first case in history. This reparations case is the first case in the history of our country to ever survive a motion to dismiss and proceed to a jury decision. This has not happened in any other case. Many reparation cases have been brought and they have all been dismissed from the door. I have passed that threshold. And the courts just simply, they demonstrated they don't know what to do. And there was a fear to say, we are going to proceed. And as Harvard's lawyer put it to the judges, you don't want to open Pandora's box here. And there is a fear to acknowledge the two systems of justice. And I say that because, firstly, I included this in the book. The Harvard Law Review did a summary of our case before the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, and they write, to whom does the great principle of justice, to whom does the great principle of justice is afforded to? And it made me realize that justice is in the eye of the beholder. And we're seeing this every day when we're looking at how the Constitution is being further eroded. It's not Black or white. It is a gray area, and it depends on the person who's sitting on the bench and whatever their political persuasion is, and whether or not they'll have the courage to uphold the Constitution. And so just an eye-opening experience for me.
Jennifer, I wonder if you have some observations. I just want to encourage people, if you have any questions, we have a few more minutes. Please include them in the Q&A, and we'll include them if we can. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, Tammy, thank you so much. This is really amazing. And there's so many things there's so many gems, but here in what you've shared, and I want to encourage people to buy the book, and because it's what you're hearing here is just the surface, really. There are two things that are on my mind. You know, one is that well, I was thinking about the beginning of the pathway, and I was wondering if you could share the story of just like, well, one of the things that comes out when you read the book is that every now and again there's almost this kismet like thing that happens where you're talking to either just a person who is the right person and neither of you know it, or just a good soul who
Yeah,
jumps in. And I was wondering if you could tell just like one kind of story about that, because to me, that's like the opposite of the Harvard. And
yeah,
it's a, you know, so I was wondering if you could just tell a little story about that. That's my one question.
yeah. And I talk about, there's that famous Shakespearean quote, there's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow, which essentially means that nothing in our past or in the future happens without God's knowledge and consent. And I just look back and I'm again, I'm just telling my story and just telling it as it happened, and hoping the reader connects the dots, because you can say, wow, this was miraculous, what a miracle, what a coincidence. And so when it just became obvious to me that these aren't just unconnected, disconnected events, there was a purpose here. And I think even as far back as 1850, with Renty and his admonition to his children to always remember and to never forget, and the fact that they each passed that down generationally so accurately as to who he was and who we are, and then in telling the story, the little things that I recorded my mom saying, or my mom told me to always remember, like we're Taylors and we're Thompson. It just so many incidents. Meeting Rose. I like to tell that story. Rose is someone I met on the internet. I could have. She happened to be the one person who could look. She looked at the document and knew that my ancestors were living, dying, and buried on the slaveholders' land. And Rose only knew that because her family purchased the land from the slaveholder and established the town, the community where my ancestors lived. But I get chills when I talk about that, because I know that Rose is the only person in the world who could have looked at that document and made that connection. She is the keeper of her family story and the genealogist who does the work. And I early on, I'm trying to tell my story, and Harvard is shutting it down and telling reporters not to report on this story. And I happened to be at an event that I just decided in the spur of the moment to go to, and I'm talking with someone who happened to be a scholar from, I think, the University of Delaware, and I'm sharing my story. She says, "Let's go to the casket and pray." And I go there to the casket of an enslaved man who was being buried at the Capitol that day. And I put my hand on the casket and I'm praying for a reporter to have the courage to write a story over Harvard's objection. And when I open my eye, there stands the reporter who writes the story, and it goes, Associated Press picks it up and it goes viral. And I just could go on and on and on, meeting Ben Crump and how I was able to get his attention, and how we put the dream team together, and just incident after incident was just the only way that I could describe it as God intervening to tell this larger story.
So Tammy, I know we're almost at time, so I wonder if you could give us an update of where the court case is right now for those who
Yeah.
are interested in knowing that. And then we're going to have Aska tune in so that she can say a few words while we transition to a larger conversation with Jean and Jennifer.
Yes, the case is continuing. We are currently still, the Supreme Court ruled that my case could go forward. And it is pending at the Middlesex Superior Court in Massachusetts. And there's not much that I can say. There is an online lookup if you wanted to look up the case. There's all the filings and all the documents that are there. But I can say that the case is still continuing and the attorneys are talking.
And how can people help support you in your work or help to honor some of the work you're doing?
Wow. I just think, just to amplify this story, to share this story, I know that the fewer people that know about this, that works to Harvard's advantage. And I want as many people to know. And I believe, like I like to say that, you tell the truth and shame the devil. I think that just by sharing this story and for many people to see and understand what I have been through for the last 15 years with Harvard, would help to kind of to encourage them to do the right thing.
Fantastic. Aska, did you want to? Yep, there we are.
Hi. Let me see. Add spotlight. Okay, now it's getting dark in my house. Thank you, Tamara Lanier and Hrag for this conversation. This is sort of winding up and with respect to your time. And I know you've been very busy since the launch of your book. And thank you for just providing this amazing context and history of your journey and your fight. And so now we will open it up with Jean Vaccaro and Jennifer Doyle and Hrag to continue this discussion as it relates to Ciencia Sexualis, the exhibition. We touched upon artists who have honored your ancestors earlier in the introduction, but we can talk more about the politics of body and we go on. So this is a transition point. So Tamara, if you'd like to stay, you're welcome to stay for this part of the conversation. Everyone, please stay. It would be lovely, and we can field some more questions. So that's that. So thank you.